Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Horton International, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you this evening. Thank you for being with us today. India today stands at the crossroads of the great talent trial. Talent from other parts of the world is required here to fuel the economy, especially in the new sectors. And Indian talent is required internationally at many places in the world. This is the crossroads where Horton International, globally, and now in India, plays a significant and a global role. We partner with clients to ensure their strategic growth with a focus on leadership and excellence. In line with our focus on leadership and excellence, we are this evening launching the Horton International Leadership Series, which will be an annual event. Our inaugural lecture is by Mr. Jerry Rao, who is a leader extraordinaire. A very warm welcome to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Divi, for your warm and cordial welcome. And it is now my privilege to introduce the speaker at the inaugural Horton International Leadership Series, Mr. Jaithirth Rao, or Mr. Jerry Rao. Jerry holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago and an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He's a published poet, a published author, a newspaper columnist, and an entrepreneur. He started Citibank's consumer businesses as country and regional manager in India, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. He then headed Citibank's Global Technology Development Division and their Global Electronics Card Division. Jerry is a veteran in consumer and corporate finance services and in technology management. He then founded Emphasis and is now the founder and chairman of Value and Budget Housing Corporation, a company which is focused on high-quality, low-cost housing for the base of the pyramid. He is the chairman of Candor Solutions Private Limited and the Clutch Group and is on the board of various companies. He is chairman on the board of trustees of NASCOM Foundation and the India Foundation for the Arts. He is a trustee, together with his wife Nilambari, of the Sujaya Foundation, which works in education and livelihoods for the underprivileged. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak on transformational leadership, please warmly welcome Mr. Jerry Rao.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The best thing I liked about the topic was transformational rather than change. I am very, very suspicious about this whole industry that has grown up, particularly among academics and consultants, around change. They go and pitch to CEOs of companies that if you don't change, you will die. And then they give them all kinds of PowerPoints again about the need for change. And then, of course, they say, we will help you implement the change. And I think this is a fundamentally flawed model because corporations, like all other great organizations and institutions, are frankly more about continuity than about change. And that's why the word transformation is far superior to using change, because change implies kind of dropping the past, whereas transformation implies somehow getting into a new incarnation without jettisoning the best of the old incarnation. If you think about it, when a caterpillar becomes a whatever chrysalis and so on, and then becomes a butterfly, the DNA doesn't change, and yet it's transformed. The DNA is the same. The DNA of the fetus is the same as the DNA of the adults that we all are here, and yet we are transformed. We are not fetus-like anymore. So I think transformation is an interesting area for all of us to talk about, and the role of leadership in transformation. Of course, all of us are leaders or would-be leaders, and therefore each of us has our own theory about what constitutes leadership. There's plenty of research, Warren Bennis among others, all kinds of people have worked on it. So there's plenty of theoretical and empirical constructs that we can use. And yet, at the end of the day, It's such a personal thing. I mean, when we talk about leadership, we really talk about people who have inspired us as individuals and whether we have been able to inspire people who have worked for us, worked with us. And each of us believes we have a certain magic, we know something. So it becomes almost knowledge that is personal, knowledge that cannot, therefore, be moved across, and hence, let's not even bother talking about it. Day, that reading Exodus and reading Henry V and thinking about them and talking about these two works when all of us meet can probably have more in terms of helping us in understanding transformational leadership. Let's talk about the Exodus first. Here is a guy whose kind of origins are unclear. I mean, any child floating on the river has to be, you have to assume some level of lack of legitimacy in the birth of the child, irrespective of what legends you may write around what happened there. And obviously not very sane, because he kind of seems to have visions in the desert on top of a hill and so on and so forth. And yet, kind of empowered and to do a particular task. And this is very important, because I think Moses had only one task, which was to get the children of Israel out of Egypt. No other task. And frankly, if Moses had been asked to lead a cricket team, he might have been a failure. So the idea that a leader and a task are intertwined, there is no such thing as a leader for all times or all events or all situations, but a leader for a task is something all of us have to remember. When we decide who is to be promoted, who is to run a project, we tend to usually say, oh, he did a good job there, or she did a good job there, let's move her on here, without thinking through the idea that the task is completely different here. And the interesting thing about the God of the Hebrews, he was a very clever fellow, the God of the Hebrews, because he was quite clear that Moses could never enter the promised land. The person to lead the Hebrews into the promised land was Joshua, was not Moses. That one situation required a leader, was a very funny leader, very, questionable legitimacy, but appropriate for that task, and another leader appropriate, and it seems so simple. And yet every time, let's be honest, each of us, 9 out of times we've screwed this up. We have promoted people or transferred people or put people in jobs based on past performance. The God of the Hebrews said, your past performance is very good. You brought them out of Egypt, but you're no good to take them into the land of Canaan. I'm going to send someone else there. In fact, Moses, as most of you might know, never even got in there. He only saw the promised land because the God of the Hebrews was very clever and understood. And this I call transformational leadership. Understanding the genetic component of the Israelite nation is going to be pretty much the same. There are pretty faithless people. Every 6 months they lose faith in their God and they misbehave. They don't, and they wander around and so on. And they need a charismatic leader, but they need different leaders for different tasks. I think this kind of lesson only the humanities can give. You can't get it, with due respect, you cannot get it from HBR or the best of books by business school professors. And certainly you cannot get it from PowerPoint presentations of consultants. Let's talk about Henry V. It's a very, very interesting situation because I wrote some time ago, some of you do read my column, so you might have come across this, that I think for many of us, our understanding of the history of England, particularly medieval England, is not from history books, but in fact is from Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's imagined history is what we think actually happened, which might not at all be the case because Shakespeare was purely a playwright writing plays to entertain. But let's look at the background of this situation. Here is Henry V, the son of Henry IV Bolingbroke, who got his kingdom illegitimately. Henry IV killed his cousin Richard II, who was a usurper. All of us in corporate world know of usurpers, right? Who take over as CEOs from people who actually were legitimate heirs by last-minute interventions of the board or somebody else, some kind of chicanery. So that's what Henry IV practiced. He was not a legitimate king, but became a king. And here is Henry V, his son, who, as a prince, is a drunkard, a womanizer, and spends most of his time with low-class people like Falstaff. And then his father dies and he becomes king. Look at the kinds of issues here that all of us deal with. You know, I'm non-exec chairman of a couple of companies. And every year we evaluate whether we should fire the CEO and get another guy or not, and what it will do to the sense of legitimacy within the whole company, and what it will do to morale, and so on and so forth. What Shakespeare's trying to tell us is that, in fact, that young Prince Henry was a womanizer and a drunkard actually qualifies him well to be the King of England. Why? Because he is acquainted with the common people. I mean, that's the reason, not because he was drinking. That was secondary. But in that process, and to my mind, I still believe that every time we look for a CEO position, be it you guys as consultants or me in my capacity as non-exec chair or whatever, one of the questions we really have to ask is, does this guy know what a salesman does? Does this guy know what an operations person does on a day-to-day basis? Does he know what a call center customer executive does? If he doesn't or she doesn't, you know, probably not the Henry V. Hasn't been through it, hasn't been bruised enough to know the troops he is going to lead. And this becomes very important when you go back into Agincourt later, which I'll come to. The fact that young Henry, Prince Henry, knew the troops and knew them by being one of them. But then he becomes king. In the very first act of Henry V, Falstaff comes to see him. Falstaff, of course, is trying to make claims to their prior acquaintance. We were great buddies. We went whoring together. Now I have to kind of get something from you, Your Majesty. And Henry kicks him out. It's one of the saddest scenes in Shakespeare. Because here's the old man, he says, "Begone, go away." Here is a young king who actually kicks away an old friend. Second point Shakespeare is making. If you don't have that streak of ruthlessness, don't try to be a CEO. It's hard. It's not easy. And people with soft kinds of stuff may say, hey, you're teaching the wrong thing. But I think the message there is that the leader has to transform. He has to go from being a prince to being a king. So the day you take a vice chairman and you make him a CEO, if he or she does not change and is not willing to bite the bullet about old loyalty, then that person is not worthy of the job. That situation demands a ruthless streak. Now, the young king is in France, and it's a hard time because he's obviously facing an enemy much bigger. And therefore, you have this situation like where you are a 5% market share company and your competitor has a 30% market share, and what are you going to do? You know, that's kind of situation. How do you motivate the troops? Everyone's got his resume out and is moving because they're not convinced you can make. And it's a very interesting leadership lesson that Shakespeare gives us. First, Henry in disguise goes around the camp at night. This is not something new. Harun al-Rashid is supposed to have gone in disguise, the Caliph of Baghdad. I mean, this is something that's a recurring motive in the humanities and literature about leadership. But more importantly, he picks up some messages. I was saying earlier to the couple of the partners of Horton that I was talking to, that when I was asked by the new expat CEO of one of India's auto companies if I had anything to tell him, I said, make sure you attend the weddings of the daughters of your dealers, because that is important. Dealers are very important. I realized that a long time ago when I was in the auto finance business, because when I went to call on a dealer along with our sales guys, the dealer would say, oh, your company is terrific, your customer service is great, you're great. But if I managed to get the dealer or a couple of dealers alone over a beer, then they would tell me, your company sucks, your customer service is terrible, you claim that you approve a loan in 48 hours, it takes you 2 weeks, your documentation requirements are horrible, your rates are too high. All of that the dealers will only tell you after a couple of beers and when your salesperson is not around. I think that's the kind of message Shakespeare's giving. It's important for Henry to get direct feedback without the intermediary layers. He gets it. He understands that many of them are worried. Many of them wish that they had more soldiers because they're outnumbered. And of course, the next day he makes one of the greatest speeches in literature, the Crispian speech, where he coined the expression band of brothers. And I think that is a very important expression for leaders to understand. Band of brothers, of course, today to be politically correct, shall I say band of brothers and sisters. But it is important to understand that that's what a leader does, is you are creating a team which is willing to take on somebody who has a market share 4 times larger than yours. You're willing to take on very difficult tasks. And I think he appeals to the grossest of human motives. He says, look, if we were too many people would share the glory. So let's be a small group. And some of us here who have been involved in startups, you know that. In startups, I've been associated with quite a few of them, I always say, hey, let's not increase the founding group. Apart from the fact that if you increase it, you have to give everyone options and all of us will be poorer. That's a kind of a... But there's also the glory. If there's fewer of us, more of us get the glory of creating something new and creating something great. So net, I'm saying let's read the Bible. Let's read Shakespeare, because we don't do that enough. We get immersed too much in the academic literature and the kind of fairly trivial quality, business, popular writing on the subject of leadership. And I don't think they really provide the insights that we're looking for, because most of them, basically they're all about gaming. I've got this good friend of mine who's HR director of a company. And he said, basically, I want to get into business world's top 10 employers in the next 2 years. And I think Business World does some poll. So he's gaming the system. He's doing things so that the employees will vote, so that he is popular and his company is popular. Whether it'll actually improve their market share or give them value, he doesn't care. He's just gaming the system. And that is the problem with most academic as well as popular management literature. It encourages you to game the system. Where I would submit to all of you that a deep understanding of the humanities, of the best of literature around the world, will actually help us engage in this task of transformation, I repeat, not change, of transformational leadership, which is what all of us have to do. I mean, how many of you here are now dealing with social media? I mean, you all grew up on bloody newspaper advertisements and television spots, and you're wasting money still on them, and suddenly we don't know. So we need to transform. But we need to do it with an understanding which only comes, I believe, by going into the best of world literature of humanities, not by avoiding them. Thank you very much. I appreciate